Today, the president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, stated that he is not involved in corruption within his inner circle and that Ukraine's anti-corruption agencies have no complaints against him personally. Of course, he cannot be responsible for everyone. He cannot. He said that former defense minister Mikhailo Fedorov deceived him and even embarrassed him in the United States of America in front of Donald Trump and even wanted to seize power and become the Minister of War. He said that by the end of the year, Ukraine would be equal to the Russians in terms of territory and would reach parity, whatever that means. He also said that elections in Ukraine right now would destroy the country, and that's why elections will only be held after the war. And that in general, it's impossible to end the war for now, since none of the allies are providing security guarantees. And he still hasn't been offered that option. How can elections be held in Ukraine? He says none of the partners who asked for these elections has explained how to hold them. President Zelensky held a closed press conference for loyal media and answered the most pressing questions there off the record, meaning not on the record. Now, loyal media assured that they asked questions about Fedorov and about corruption, and they were satisfied with the answers. But opposition-minded journalists insist that it was just for show and raise follow-up questions. What about the president? Can the president really not know about corruption in his closest circle? And how can he not know that the president's office staff communicates, for example, with the scandalous Timur Mindic, who gives instructions from Israel? In general, let's now analyze and discuss the latest statement by the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, which was made at this closed press conference. My name is Alexey Pechiy, let's discuss this topic together. But before we start, please subscribe to this channel, like the video, and be sure to leave your comment. So, the president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, after calls to hold a press conference with Ukrainian journalists, after there were even attempts to register a petition on the president's office website, which for some reason is not being registered, and after calls for Zelensky to answer the pressing questions about corruption and reshuffles in the government. Because the silence from Bankova Street had become deafening, Zelensky finally held such a press conference, but not in front of the cameras. And not on the record, and only for a select few loyal journalists. Nevertheless, my task here is not to evaluate the format itself, but to analyze what was actually said at this press conference by the President of Ukraine. Of course, right now everyone is concerned about the issue of corruption in the president's office. Zelensky said that the heads of anti-corruption agencies have no questions directly for him. And according to him, he understands, or rather they understand, that he, meaning Volodymyr Zelensky, personally is definitely not involved in corrupt activities. This is how the president commented on the corruption cases involving former representatives of the president's office, in particular, the former deputy head of the president's office, Irina Mudra, who according to NABU recordings suggested not fighting corruption, but to lead it and to systematize it. Well, she also laundered bags of cash to pay bail of 150 million hryvnias for former minister Chernyshov. And according to Volodymyr Zelensky, he has no additional information on these cases that isn't already in the public domain. He claims he didn't know anything, didn't see anything, and has nothing at all to add to any of this. Next is a quote from Zelensky. There were enough details to dismiss her. I actually heard some conversations about certain actions, real or potential, at the same time as you did. It's not appropriate to discuss this now. What was said there, I believe, is enough for the deputy and another person in the department to be dismissed. If additional information appears, we will respond to it accordingly. The anti-corruption agencies continue to work independently. They take certain actions and we respond to those actions. If it's a minister and there are grounds for dismissal, then they should be dismissed. If there are some unclear points, we need to wait for additional details and for the court's verdict. President Zelensky also stated that the heads of the anti-corruption agencies have no complaints against him personally. And for some reason, he is confident that they definitely don't suspect him of anything. Here is the quote. They understand perfectly well that I am not involved in anything like that, and that's important to me. Well, basically, that was the entire response to the whole corruption scandal that shook all of Ukraine, and it's still causing a stir. Starting with Mindich, then Yermak, then Chernyshev, and now Mudre. And it seems like all of this is getting closer and closer to the president's office. It's already reached the office itself. But Zelensky said, I didn't know anything, I didn't see anything, and NABU and SAP, the president is sure, have no complaints against him. The whole essence of Zelensky's answer, it seems to me, came down to one phrase. I didn't know anything, I'm not guilty. And when I found out, I immediately fired the people, although some questions remain open. Did Zelensky really not know that the top leadership of his office was collecting dirty money for bail for the former minister? Or did President Zelensky really not know and still doesn't know that, according to NABU data, the top leadership of his own office, that is, the president's office, continues to have contact with the scandalous Timur Mindich? Or maybe Zelensky hasn't drawn any conclusions? After his former head of office, Andrei Yermak, was also came under suspicion of corruption, all of this looks a bit strange. Zelensky also commented on the topic of elections and stated that holding elections during a full-scale war carries great risks and could lead to division in society. To put it very simply, Zelensky is saying, forget it, there will be no elections. According to him, about a year ago, Ukraine was being pressured from various quarters to hold elections during the war. Here is a quote. My position was clear. If our partners offer us specific conditions under which it would be possible to safely, legitimately and democratically hold elections in Ukraine with the participation of the military, in the frontline territories abroad where millions of our citizens have gone to escape the war, safely, that is, without strikes and shelling, then let's discuss it. Zelensky also noted that at that time none of the Western partners offered specific conditions that could guarantee the safety of holding elections. I have one simple question here. Why is that? Why should our partners be the ones thinking about how to hold elections in Ukraine? And why should our partners be the ones offering any options? The rhetoric itself sounds like this. Zelensky says, well, yes, someone suggested holding elections, but I said, okay, then go ahead and suggest to me how. And so, when our partners couldn't suggest how, he says, well then, there won't be any elections. The question is, did the Ukrainian president's team and parliament even consider how to implement this? Were there any questions? Were there any discussions? Were there any concrete plans from which we can conclude, well, it's impossible. That's it, we've worked through different scenarios. There are separate crisis teams that develop scenarios, assess probabilities, calculate risks, and so on. And in the end they say, listen, we've done such extensive work and we come to the conclusion that, well, no, it's impossible. That would have completely settled the issue for the public. Here, it's important to understand that everyone fully realizes that it's dangerous to hold elections. But this work was not done, and in the end Zelensky gave a clear answer. He doesn't want any elections. He has a completely different goal. Here is his quote. I believe that in a war like this, elections in general are a huge risk. Elections right now would be a tsunami for the state that would split Ukraine apart. That's why my strategy is to see the country through to the end of the war and preserve an independent and sovereign state. And I am carrying it out. A separate question. This is the confrontation with former Defense Minister Mikhailo Fedorov. Yes, it is indeed a confrontation. President Zelensky said that after dismissing Fedorov from the Ministry of Defense, he offered him 4 different options for continuing to work with the team, but he refused. Quote, usually I don't meet with people 4 times to offer them a job, because I think it's simply unconstructive. In this case, I did it, considering our good and long-standing relationship. By the way, this resonates with what Fedorov himself said, that loyalty, when it comes to appointments to certain positions, is valued much higher than competence. And here Zelensky says that we had a good long-standing relationship, that's why I offered Fedorov some kind of role 4 times. There you go. The president assured that he personally thinks highly of the former minister, but he is sure that he went down the wrong path. Quote, and I really did and still do think very highly of Mikhail. We went through a lot together, but I believe that he himself is going or is being pushed into the wrong things. Zelensky did not specify exactly which things. But he did say that Mikhail Fedorov allegedly wanted to create a Ministry of War in order to seize full power, but the president immediately said that this would not happen. Zelensky explained that the Ministry of Defense is responsible for supplying the military, while the command of the army should remain a separate function defined by law. According to him, after the first conversation, Fedorov replied that he understood the president, but later tried to achieve the same goal in a less direct way. Next, I will quote Zelensky. I called him at the very beginning and said, "The Ministry of War, when there is no commander-in-chief and the chief of the general staff is basically under you, forget about that presentation." There was such a presentation about the Ministry of War. He replied, "I hear you." However, later Fedorov started looking for other ways to achieve the same goal. So, in other words, Zelensky claims that supposedly Mikhail Fedorov at some point decided to take full control of the entire army command, to actually eliminate the position of commander-in-chief and to follow the example of the Pentagon in the United States of America. To create a Ministry of War, where there is a Minister of War and all the army leadership is under him, and there is no commander-in-chief. There is just a chief of staff and nothing more. So this is a completely different structure, and according to Zelensky, Fedorov tried to build such a structure for himself. Separately, the president critically assessed the actions of the commander-in-chief of the armed forces of Ukraine, Alexander Syrsky. According to Zelensky, Syrsky responded to the initiatives of the Ministry of Defense with his own bureaucracy, and the president called such a reaction wrong. In another conversation, Fedorov, as Zelensky reports, suggested firing both of them outright. He said, "Okay, if you think we can't find common ground, then both of us, me and him, should go right away." The president replied that personnel decisions would be made one after another. During the war, he would not dismiss the Minister of Defense and the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine on the same day. In addition, Zelensky said that supposedly Fedorov assured him that Elon Musk had already agreed to allow Ukraine to use Starlink systems over Russia, and that all that was needed was to get permission from Donald Trump. But according to Zelensky, when he asked Trump about the same thing, according to him, it turned out that Elon Musk had not given such permission, and supposedly Fedorov deceived him and therefore embarrassed him in front of the American president. You know, personally, this reminded me of another press conference in the off-the-record format in November 2023. This was before my decision, when I was still in Kiev and attended such events. So, back then, Zelensky told journalists, again in the same format as the recent press conference. It's a closed format. That Valery Zaluzhny was personally to blame for the failure of the 2023 counteroffensive. Because, in his opinion, he miscalculated how much armored equipment was needed for the offensive. Supposedly, Zelensky and the office of the president had one vision of how much equipment was needed and where to send it, while Zaluzhny had a different vision, and Zaluzhny made a mistake, so he is to blame. It sounded strange, but almost 3 months later, as you remember, Zelensky dismissed Zaluzhny and sent him as ambassador to Britain. And the final touch. Zelensky stated that by the end of 2026, Ukraine expects to reach parity between the amount of territory Russia has occupied since the beginning of the year and the territory liberated by the defense forces of Ukraine. According to the president, since the beginning of 2026, Russian troops have occupied 990 square kilometers of Ukrainian territory. At the same time, the defense forces have regained control over 820 square kilometers. However, it is still unclear whether this will somehow push Russia toward negotiations. And finally, according to Zelensky, Russia is not ready to end the war without demanding Ukraine's withdrawal from Donbass. According to the president, neither the US nor Europe can currently guarantee that Russia will not go further after that. This is one of the possible negotiation options. The ceasefire being discussed with the US and Europe involves both sides withdrawing and creating a buffer, free economic zone, under the control of a third party altogether. And finally, in my opinion, the most dangerous point was made. Volodymyr Zelensky believes that the most realistic window for a diplomatic end to the war is from the end of 2026 to the end of summer 2027. I'll just remind you that such windows appear every 6 months, and every 6 months they get pushed another 6 months ahead. Throughout the full-scale war, we've been hearing that it will end by the end of this year. Then no, let's say by midsummer, or the end of summer for sure, and then it gets pushed to the next year. And I think this is a very dangerous strategy, a very disheartening strategy. Why? Because it makes people believe that the war will end relatively soon, and then it's very painful to be disappointed. Look at what's happening. This happens every 6 months. That is, Zelensky says the next window of opportunity to end the war is from the end of 2026 to the end of summer 2027. And people start organizing their lives in anticipation that these predictions will come true. They start adjusting their lives to the idea that by the end of summer 2027, everything will definitely be over. But it might not end, and then people get disappointed once again, fall into this pit, and this keeps repeating over and over. Just remember how many times Volodymyr Zelensky and the head of his office, Kyrylo Budanov, said that the war would end soon, that the window for diplomacy was opening, that negotiations would start any moment now. It's actually very dangerous. People just can't live in this constant illusion. I'll leave it at that. Share your opinions and conclusions in the comments under this episode. Friends, if you want to support the work of an independent YouTube channel, I would appreciate any support from you in the form of a donation or by becoming a sponsor on YouTube. All the links and details on how to do this are in the description of this video. That's all for now. Take care of yourselves. Goodbye everyone.